do I regret buying The Last of Us Part 1 Remake? Because this is a very expensive game with absolutely no real features. It doesn't feature new content, it doesn't have any big flashy DLC, it doesn't have any multiplayer. It is just the original game from 2013 with a fresh coat of paint. But is that enough? Is a game that has such a spectacular story, such emotional notes to its conveyance, is it enough to pay $70 for an upgraded remaster of a game we've been playing for almost a decade? Today, I want to try and talk about that in a brutally honest review, but I want us to try and be calm about this. Surprisingly, it feels like even discussing The Last of Us Part 1 Remake has become one of the most controversial topics in the entire PlayStation community during 2022. I have actually been flooded with hate. I've had people claiming that I'm the worst person in the world for criticizing this game. It's extremely exhausting, but I want to try and discuss this because I do feel like criticism is incredibly important, which is why I decided to buy this with my own money. A lot of the reviewers, of course, got early copies, which I have no problem with, but I thought since this game is so incredibly expensive, I wanted to purposely spend the money on that high price tag so I could be objective and make sure this really is something that's worth that, well, full price PS5 experience. So let's talk about it. Let's discuss the goods, the bads, and the uglies in my review of The Last of Us Part 1. What's up, gamers? DreamcastGuy here. Hi, hope you're having a great day. If you could like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. If this video hits 3,000 likes, I am going to be giving away a copy of The Last of Us Part 1 on PlayStation 5 over my Twitter account. But now, let's try and discuss what's really going on. First and foremost, let's discuss the biggest part of this entire debate. Before we even talk about the game, let's just settle the argument that this is, in fact, a full-blown remake from a technical standpoint. I mean, that's what Sony is claiming. The developers are saying that this isn't a remaster, even though it doesn't have any big new additions. I feel like there's two different styles of remake that exist now. Sometimes there's games that are like the Shadow of the Colossus on PlayStation 4 or something like Demon's Souls on PlayStation 5. These are games that are reconstructions of the original thing. They have better graphics, but other than that, it's the original experience just spruced up. Sometimes there's some extra bells and whistles, but the whole point is preserving that original masterpiece. And then there's the remakes that I feel like are discussed a bunch more. Things like the Resident Evil 2 remake or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, which are actually complete rebuilds. These are games that have new graphics, new levels, new tricks, new extra stuff that's going to surprise you even if you've beaten the original games 100 times over. The Last of Us Part 1, it's definitely trying to be the more tried and true style, which is the exact same game except with better visuals. Now, I don't have a problem with that, mostly because I do enjoy the original Last of Us so much. I've always believed that this is one of the best games ever, from a storytelling standpoint, from the voice acting standpoint, from a lot of the combat standpoints. I thought this game, when it was released back in 2013, was perhaps one of the most important storytelling experiences we've ever gotten on a PlayStation console. But playing it again now, I feel like my reflection back upon this, the new graphics, they definitely help in a way that I didn't really expect them to be able to do. This is very much almost an interactive movie in the positive sense, in that there is these tense moments where you're trying to reload your gun and shotgun blast another zombie before it can grab you, or there's somebody that's coming up and you need to hurry up and craft a bomb before they're able to flank you. The fluidity of the gameplay is certainly a part of this game that I've enjoyed a lot, but it does feel like the real star of the show, the primary reason you play The Last of Us, is to beat Joel and Ellie. So in this game, the primary feature of this remake is, of course, the fact that it's got completely rebuilt graphics engines. And when you first start playing it, a lot of this stuff can seem sort of subtle, especially if you haven't played The Last of Us Remastered recently. The character models back then actually worked pretty well because there were these nice hard lines, there was deep shadows, there was a lot of actual good motion capture and stuff they'd done with those characters even way back a decade ago. Whereas now, they're able to do a little bit more that's very, very essential. They've actually redone every single character model in The Last of Us Part 1 Remake, which has a weird side effect. everybody definitely looks a lot older. Joel, Ellie, even Tess, all these characters look much more realistically aged, which is very strange at times because it does create this effect where they almost seem like different characters with the voices we know and love coming out of them. Like, it's kind of strange that Joel is roughly my age and this dude looks like crap. But as much as some people have been hating on that, I kind of feel like this is the more realistic interpretation of it. I mean, they're in the zombie apocalypse. Nobody's properly moisturizing or being able to brush their teeth 3 times a day, probably. They're not drinking enough water, so they're probably aging like milk. It happens. This is not at all a happy story. So, of course, the characters look understandably grimy and depressed. But this does bring me to the part of this game that feels the most fundamentally technologically overhauled, which is the lighting engine. It seems like the basic reason they keep saying that this is rebuilt from the ground up from the PlayStation 5 is because of this. So in the original game, everything looked pretty decent. I definitely loved it for years and years and years. I've done a ton of playthroughs of the original Last of Us. But at times, you could definitely tell that a lot of stuff had to be simulated. A lot of stuff like gleaming fires or your flashlights, they could look good, they were certainly functional, but they weren't really realistic. You know, it was sort of like the idea of a flashlight more than the full power of a spotlight connected to you. The lighting in this game is way, way better. It's able to be reflective. It's managed to have that nice glare at times, but it does also sort of bring me to a downside to this. So the developers have been discussing on Twitter about some of the changes they've made. Apparently, the goal of The Last of Us Part 1 Remake was hyper-realism, to make this look as close to actual reality as humanly possible. So some features actually seem to have been changed, like whenever you're fighting bloaters, when bloaters would explode, it'd be this cool, like, glaring neon look. They've removed that. This was in the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4 version, and now it's just like a big cloud of like light yellow fog. And apparently the reason they did that is because they feel like this is a more realistic portrayal of what this splash effect would look like. There's also other things that happen with the audio itself. Sometimes when you would kick open doors in the original version, they would explode in a cloud of splinters and make this explosive crash because you are a full force survival freaking nutcase kicking down a door, whereas now it's much more muted. There are these thousands of tiny changes that I feel like people who have played the original games again and again and again will definitely notice and sometimes appreciate. But I do feel like newcomers are probably not going to notice these tweaks. This new graphics engine in general is certainly impressive, but I still just don't feel like it's fully worth the price tag on its own. Simply because right now, you can buy the original version of The Last of Us Part 1, like the original game, back for like $20. You can find it for like $5 on eBay. If you want, you can even subscribe to PlayStation Plus Essentials and just play the game inside the collection as part of the subscription fee. In fact, the gameplay you've seen of it, I didn't even put my disc into my PlayStation 5. I just played it off the Essentials collection. And that version is the same story with the same features, the same characters, the same everything. It's just, you know, slightly worse looking. But that does bring me to the environments and the gameplay, because it feels like the biggest critique I've heard of The Last of Us Part 1 Remake from my friends and stuff is just the fact that it does feel outdated. This is a tiny experience. You're going from place to place. Joel and Ellie essentially have to walk across the United States, sometimes stealing cars, sometimes on horseback, stuff like that. But the whole point of it is to try and get to this far off CDC lab that may be able to save the world. I love the story of The Last of Us, but let's face it, it has some very tiny environments. The whole game is pretty much just leafy, scummy hallways where a couple enemies block your path. There's no real side deviations. There is some optional dialogue and stuff, but for the most part, this is just point A to point B to point C. Now, I have to say, I disagree with a lot of these critiques because I do feel like this game is still just so focused. It definitely still works. But that does make me want to discuss the other thing they've claimed they've improved, which is the AI. So apparently in the technological aspects of the original Last of Us back on PlayStation 3, the game had to be very much cobbled together with some very loose code. Character models could only actually see so much, enemies couldn't detect you very well. They've managed to pump up the AI quite a bit. Now there can be tons of enemies on screen at once, all individually just trying to process, react, attack. They can call out enemies, they can try and flank you, they can try and do a bunch of tiny things that seem cool, but I'll be honest, even with these upgrades, the AI isn't spectacular. Like, a lot of times it just felt like by jumping through a window, by going down some stairs or something like that, you became instantly invisible. The AI here meant to try and improve it. They've done things where now the characters, the enemies, actually see you. So being able to stay hidden is much more accurate. It's much more close to the realism they're trying to obtain, but I don't feel like it feels different. I was kind of hoping that on the harder difficulties or something, this extra AI would adapt to be even more difficult, but it doesn't feel like it is. Like, even having played through this now, it doesn't feel like these new enemies are any scarier in a game that I do feel like is trying to be scary. I've always had a deep appreciation for the sort of grindiness at times to the combat in Last of Us Part 1, because there's something so interesting about the idea that stealth is just so important. A lot of these monsters can instant kill you. Some of these monstrous humans will rip you apart or bash your brains out if they get a chance to grab you even for a couple seconds. I've always thought that was interesting, that sometimes staying out of sight and out of mind is so incredibly powerful. It's cool that crafting a bomb or being able to just make a little arrow and stealth kill somebody before the fight actually begins in earnest, those little tiny moments become so much more impactful, and I do feel like not being able to sharpen the AI more, not being able to make the enemies feel a little bit closer to The Last of Us Part 2, that does feel like a bit of a detriment. I also feel like after having played Last of Us Part 2 like 5 times last month, literally 5 times, that game just had such brilliant gameplay of being able to have large groups of enemies and big dynamic battlefields where you're constantly trying to worry about, is people above me? Can I scrounge something? Can I break line of sight and lay down in some deep grass and bandage myself? It feels weird to go back to a game that is more primitive after playing a game that's so advanced. We do have to keep in mind that it's in this very peculiar spot where The Last of Us Part 1 Remake is by far the most expensive Last of Us game right now, but it's not the best gameplay. It may have the best graphics, but Last of Us Part 2 has way better combat that's going to be way more fun to play, and yet is somehow a much cheaper disc than this game is. And that's just the very bizarre truth of it. But this brings me to the biggest problem of this remake, is the fact that I do feel like the total lack of new content is a detriment. The fact that there isn't one extra cutscene, the fact that there's not some extra tiny chapter to help tie together Last of Us Part 1 to Last of Us Part 2, there isn't some extra nod to the extended universe, there isn't some extra battle modes or special arena combat or anything like that, there isn't even any multiplayer or anything like that, so you're actually getting less gameplay in total than the original game, which kind of does suck, because if you consider it, most of the Last of Us fans, I guess all Last of Us fans, have beaten both the games we have right now, Part 1 and Part 2. So playing through Part 1 now, I mean, you're going to get absolutely nothing out of this. I mean, you've already seen all this. It's a little bit better looking, but it's the same story set from the same characters by the same voice actors in the exact same cadence. So the fact that there isn't just anything to really spruce this up or make the package more appealing, that does kind of suck. I've beaten this game now, the original Last of Us, like 10 separate times. I've beaten it back with one of my girlfriends. I've played it online with my buddies, doing a bunch of the online matches for months and months and months. And so the fact that this is just the exact same thing again for way more price tag, it just doesn't quite seem worth it. And this brings me to the final point that I did want to discuss, because a lot of people seem to be celebrating it, but these features are not something I've really been using it, but there is a ton of additional accessibility options. They've done all sorts of stuff. I actually wrote it down here. You can actually change your field of view. You can make it so the game has lock-on aiming. You have all sorts of stuff like, for those of us who have motion sickness problems, sometimes I'm very susceptible to motion sickness. You can turn off stuff like motion blur. You can turn off camera shake. There's all these weird special special things that can make it where you can just automatically skip every puzzle in the game. You can make it so you have infinite breath, so you can never fail the swimming sections. It's strange that there is just so much extra stuff you can toggle off. You can even actually disable sections of the enemy code to make it where the monsters will never try and grab you. You can make it where the foes themselves are just dumber and won't actually see you while you're walking around. There's even an invisibility button. What? This is bonkers. I mean, it's impressive they managed to put so much in here, but at the same time, I'm still just kind of shocked that this is really the only stuff in here that sort of changes the experience, and it's features that I'm never really going to toggle on. Like, one of the things is you can turn on super slow motion. That's great, but in a game that I'm trying to get scared from, that's definitely going to be counteractive to the experience. So I guess in the grand scheme of things, do I regret buying The Last of Us Part 1 Remake? Yes. I think I do regret buying it just because it is so expensive. I'm probably still going to platinum it because I already have it now and the game is such an easy platinum. I might as well do it. I want to find all the trophies. I do enjoy trophy hunting, but as it stands, I really wish this game cost $40 or $50 or was included with PlayStation Plus Premium or maybe give it away with PlayStation 5s for those people that do have the console as like a cool extra incentive of like, welcome to the future. This does feel like a bit of a Sony cash grab, and I say that as a person that predominantly plays on PlayStation. But we've heard some good and some bad. Let's go over to the ratings board and put a big number on it. I am giving The Last of Us Part 1 Remake a 9 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, gamers. If you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I didn't offend you too much, be sure to give this video a big old thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all, and keep dreaming. I'm actually a little bit nervous about uploading this. It is going to be a, oh boy, this comment section is going to be a doozy. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.